And let me introduce our next speaker, Ryan Helbach.
Thank you. So good morning, everyone. As Steve mentioned, my name is Ryan Helbach. I am the Chief Intrapreneur for the Air Force Research Labs. You're going to get to see a little bit of what it means to be an intrapreneur. Think of an entrepreneur, but inside of a large organization. I'm going to talk about that, but as well I'm going to talk about kind of what I see is happening within the defense world and specifically within the acquisition world of the DoD. So I actually reside in the headquarters of AFRL, sit in the small business office, so do a lot. Institutes and Innovation. So I'm going to talk about all of that today. I'm going to try and keep it somewhat entertaining, so please feel free to laugh at my terrible jokes. Feel free to jump in if you have questions. I know everybody's very spread out. Just throw up your hand or shout something out. I'm very laid back about that. So I always start off my presentations. I'm a father of 2 kids, so I always start them off with a terrible dad joke. So hopefully you guys are waking up for a really bad dad joke. So we have a printer in our office. We call it Bob Marley. And the reason we call it Bob Marley is because it's always jamming, man. There we go, there we go, all right. So today I'm going to talk about the evolution of what I see as research and development. It's mostly focused more on kind of the commercial corporate side, but I think it has huge implications on the defense world and government research and development. I'm also going to talk about what's called the innovator's dilemma. So I want to start things off a little bit here with, if we can go to the next slide. Okay, does anybody know what this is? Any guesses? Any guesses? Somebody? Anybody? Camera, very good. Anybody, any idea what camera this is? Kodak Brownie, who said that? Yeah, very good, excellent. So this is the Kodak Brownie. This is what brought cameras to the mass market. So the Kodak Eastman, they were selling it for $1. Around late 1800s, early 1900s, they started selling it for $1 to the mass market. Really got the idea of cameras out to the common people. So you can thank Kodak for your smiling selfies, right? So Kodak was trying to sell these cameras, and traditionally, when folks would get their picture taken, they would stand there and they wouldn't smile, right? They wouldn't smile. And partly that was a legacy from paintings, because paintings would take so long. You didn't want to be smiling that whole time. Your face would hurt. But then as well, it also took a little while to do old school pictures. And so they started encouraging people to smile so that they would have more fun. They would take more pictures, and that's so Kodak could then sell more film. So if we go to the next slide. Does anybody know what this is? All right, somebody say it real loud. So it's a camera, right? It's also from Kodak, from 1975. This is one of the first digital cameras. So 1975, Kodak had the initial prototypes for a digital camera, right? And actually, there's some ties with the DoD. If you go out and you look at what was done with satellites, we used to send satellites up into space. They would take pictures and we'd drop the film back down. Well, that was a lot of logistics, very expensive, and so the government worked with Kodak to come up with digital cameras. Kodak was able to miniaturize that as well. I won't ask what this is because it's already up there, but what's interesting about this is from 1996. This is the first camera, quote unquote digital camera, that was sold mass to the market. So Kodak spent $500 million developing this camera. $500 million developing this digital camera. They were pretty much the first ones to the market with this. But what was fascinating about it, if you look at the picture, there's still that roll of film in there. That roll of film is in there. So it had like the little screen in the back with that you could see what the picture was going to look like, but they were still using the old school film because they still believed that everybody would want to print off their pictures. Now, how many folks print off all their pictures on there that they take on their cell phone, right? So the market evolved. So it had some unique features. They spent a lot of money to get this out there, but they were holding on to that film because they controlled 2/3 of the market for film. And they were making so much money on that film and film development that they didn't want to disrupt themselves, right? They didn't want to lose those billions of dollars just to get maybe a couple hundred million, 10 million, right? So they had an incentive not to do that. But everybody's familiar with the Kodak Moment? What happened to Kodak, right? What happened to Kodak? So this was fascinating. Yesterday I was presenting same presentation at the Defense Acquisition University up in Ohio, in Kettering, Ohio. And the building that we were in is a former Kodak building. Kodak built the building. They used to have a couple thousand people in the building. It is now, part of it is now DAU. So what has happened to Kodak, and what happened to Kodak? How did they get disrupted? So there's an interesting book out there that I really like. It's called The Innovator's Dilemma. So it's really got two theories, and I'm going to talk about those two theories as to why did Kodak fail, and others such as Fujifilm, why did they succeed where Kodak failed? So innovation. Obviously today is about innovation, small business innovation. Can anybody tell me what innovation is? Come on, you guys are very smart people. Please, somebody. Any guesses? Way in the back. Very good. I like that. That's very good. I think somebody else had their hand up as well. All right. Very good. So the definition, very similar to what you guys. This is what I use. There are a number of different definitions, but this is the one I kind of like. It's basically translating an idea or invention into a product, service, policy, or process. So Uber. How many folks have ridden in Uber in the last week or so? Right? Yeah? What's Uber's innovation? It's service, right? They're connecting the end user with the supply and demand, right? They're cutting out the middleman. But it's also around policy, right? So traditionally, if you were a taxi, you would have to spend thousands, tens of thousands of dollars to get what they call a medallion, basically your license to be a taxi. And there was all kinds of regulations that went with it, all kinds of requirements that went with it. What's fascinating about Uber is they went around all of that, right? So their innovation, yes, it was somewhat on the electronic, on the service side of things, but it was also on the policy side of things, right? And they still run into all kinds of issues with traditional taxi services, basically saying, wait, why do we have to follow all these requirements and Uber doesn't, right? So two different theories that were put forth in the innovator's dilemmas. The first one is this idea of what's called SCurves. So if you look at a corporation over time, what it goes through is kind of, they call it an S-curve development. So you have an early business development, and hopefully it actually takes off and it grows very rapidly. Then it gets kind of through that growth phase, it becomes a mature business. Mature business, let's take Kodak as an example, right? They developed this Brownie camera, they ended up selling a bunch of them, they grew exponentially, and then they started to control that market. And so they were focused on sustaining that market, right? Back to the film. They wanted to stay in that film market because that's where all their money was coming in. But what happens is technology and new businesses and new models come along, and you start a new S-curve. And so that new S-curve could disrupt your current, it will disrupt your current business model. And the question is whether you as a corporation or you as an institution or you as a country jump to that next S-curve. And where do you jump to that S-curve? So what was fascinating, again, I mentioned, I presented at Defense Acquisition University yesterday. There was actually somebody that had worked at Kodak in that classroom, and she was talking about how Kodak, they started this new business within their organization around printing digital pictures. They spent some money, but then they spun it off. They sold it to another company for $70 million. And then 3 years later, they bought it back for $300 million, right? So they were basically saying, oh, we don't think this is going to be a market. And then it turns out it was a market, and they were on the wrong end of that, So you get disrupted on that S-curve. And you also have the second hypothesis that he puts forward is that you have this inclination of, I'm in this market, I don't want to disrupt myself, right? So technology development, if you, again, kind of take this S-curve idea, it goes through a number of phases. How many folks are familiar with blockchain and Bitcoin? A few folks. What about the internet? Is anybody familiar with the internet? All right, let's talk about the internet then. So the internet, if you go back to the early 90s, how many folks were cognizant in the early 90s, maybe? Yeah, all right, good. So it went through this phase where you start to have kind of the initial inception of the idea, you have some very early adopters, and then it starts to go through what's called a frenzy phase, right? That frenzy phase was that dot-com boom, right? We went through all these different things, all these new startups, and then all of a sudden, the bubble bursts, right? So you have all this development, and I would argue it's happening now with blockchain and Bitcoin. You go through this frenzy phase, and I'm going to put forward the theory that I think the DoD and the acquisition community within the DoD is going through this frenzy phase right now. But then you have the bubble burst. But what comes out of that bubble is, let's again go back to the internet example, all that frenzied development had laid the foundation for what came next. You now had fiber optics that were connecting the country. You had companies that had validated a business model, and yeah, maybe the company didn't succeed, but they at least validated that there was a demand in the market. And so then you start to have the Googles, the Facebooks, right? All those other quote-unquote golden age internet companies develop out of that bubble, right? And then you go into maturity. Well, be aware of it, sneaking up out over here is the next surge. And so you can look at it for technology, you can look at it for any kind of different technology. We're constantly going through these cycles. How many folks feel like the technology development, even in their personal life, let's ignore the work world for a minute, in their personal life, it's becoming more and more rapid and it's getting somewhat stressful? Anybody feel like that? I know I do sometimes, right? So what is happening? Not only are we going through those S-curves, but we're going through them much more rapidly. So if you look at what I've got here, there's a lot of lines on here, but let's just take the far end and the far two ends, the two extremes. So on one end, you can look at the development of the telephone. So this is a graph of the adoption rate in the US of technologies. So the telephone line. We look at it, developed, started to get into the market in the early 1900s. It wasn't until about the 1980s that it really reached a good portion of the market, right? So it was taking decades for new technologies to get into the market and to be adopted by the wider community. Let's look at the other extreme of it, and tablets, smartphones. How many folks had the first iPhone when it came out? Yeah? All right, handful of folks. How many folks have smartphones now? All right, who doesn't have a smartphone? I'm just curious on that one. Okay, all right, there's always some. The peer pressure. but right, I mean, to think 10 years ago, nobody had smartphones. Now everybody has it. How many folks, well, except for you, how many folks could throw their phone into the lake today, into the water today, and be okay with it for a week without it? How many folks? All right, right? But that's a small number of folks, right? We have become so addicted to this. So not only are we going through these S-curves, but we're going through these S-curves much more rapidly. Okay, so yes, I told the story of Kodak. Kodak, we have the Kodak Moment. But there is hope, right? There is hope. Fujifilms is a very good example. They were the dominant player in the Japanese market. Kodak, Fujifilms, they were the two global competitors. Fujifilm survived. And the reason they survived is because they recognized that the digital photography was going to occur, and they said, all right, we recognize this is going to happen, it's going to disrupt our business, and we've got to do something about it. And so they took 3 different pathways and recognized that probably 2 of the paths aren't going to work out, but let's at least try something. So they diversified, they tried some other things. They're still around today. In fact, they're trying to acquire Xerox, right? Another company that has gone through that S-curve, right? So I've got a number of other companies here for the gamers in here. Nintendo. Does anybody know what Nintendo started out as? Playing cards. Who said that? Yeah, playing cards, right? Playing cards. But then, as well, you know, again, if you think back a couple decades, the old Nintendo video games, I mean, they did arcade games as well, right? They have evolved multiple times. Yes, they're still somewhat in this gaming space, but they have evolved how they interact with their customers and what they're bringing to the customer. GE, yes, GE's going through some struggles right now, but GE has gone through many iterations of what they look like. And I would argue that, yeah, they're going through some challenges right now, but I think they'll come out of it with a different focus and an area that they're focusing on. Berkshire Hathaway. Does anybody know the story of Berkshire Hathaway? Or let's start. Does anybody know or who Berkshire Hathaway is or what the company is? Yeah. So it's Warren Buffett's company, right? Warren Buffett's company. So Berkshire Hathaway was I think a New England company that was doing textiles. Well, the textile industry in the U.S. was going through that S-curve. And so what happened was Warren Buffett recognized that this was happening, and so he was buying shares of this company at a low price and then selling it back to the company at a higher price and making money on it. Well, the company, the owners of the company said, no, we're going to renege on our deal with you, and we're going to sell it back at that lower price. Well, that upset Warren Buffett, and so he just bought the whole company. And he got rid of the textiles, and he then used it as his umbrella company for his larger acquisitions. So again, he evolved what Berkshire Hathaway was doing. IBM's a good example. How many folks had, back in the 1980s, 1990s, had an IBM computer, or used an IBM computer? Yeah, right? How many folks use an IBM computer today? Right? What does IBM do today? Software business consulting, right? Business consulting largely. That's where they're making their money. They evolved on that S-curve. Okay, so one last thing, and then I'm going to switch over and talk more on the DoD side of things. So what you're also seeing is the fact that, yes, you're going through all these S-curves, and technology is being developed much more quickly. You're being disrupted much more quickly. And so the idea of research and development, again, this is on the corporate side, but I'm going to argue that it also affects the DoD side of things, has gone largely from back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, very ad hoc, kind of an individual inventor or a couple inventors, to you then had the in-house research and development labs, Bell Labs, right? Bell Labs, GE had their labs. Largely, I would argue, some of AFRL's model currently is that in-house research. But in the last 2 decades, it's evolved. It's evolved quite a bit. And it's because of this technology disruption. So corporations have gone to what's called a corporate venture capital, as well as incubators and outposts. So corporate venture capital is, let's go back to the Kodak model. That's basically saying, Kodak's saying, all right, we know we're going to get disrupted by the next S-curve, so we're just going to buy up the startup that's going to disrupt us, right? And as a startup, largely, a lot of times that's their goal of, hey, I want my $100 million buyout, and it's going to be Kodak that buys me out, right? And so Kodak has the money, theoretically has the money to do this, and then they're not spending $500 million investing and building that digital camera that really isn't what the market wants. They're just buying the company that's already validated that business model. And so as well, kind of in line with that, there's also this development of incubators and outposts. So a good example of an outpost is in Silicon Valley or in Boston. Big corporations will set up locations in those areas so that they can get a pulse of what's going on. And I'm going to talk about how the DoD is doing that as well. And then as well, incubators. So rather than saying, all right, we're going to wait until that startup's $100 billion, we're actually going to grow that startup by setting up an environment that says, all right, if you're in the camera market, we'll give you a little bit of seed money to help your startup grow, but we want to take a little bit of equity so that as you grow and as you get to that point that we think you're taking off, we could actually then pluck you up and roll you into a bigger corporation. So you see this evolution, and within the last couple of years, you're now seeing it within the DoD. And so let's switch over and kind of put on the defense lens for a minute. So in my view, I think the DoD acquisition community needs to evolve. I think we're already doing some of what's up here, the in-house research, the international partnerships. We're starting to see more and more focus on rapid prototyping, rapid acquisition. The new head of the Air Force Acquisitions, Dr. Roper, he's a big proponent of rapid acquisitions, rapid prototyping. We got some authorities from Congress 2 years ago. He is pushing that heavily. His goal is he wants to cut a century of acquisition timeline off the Air Force acquisition. He wants to cut a century of timeline off acquisition. What I would argue is the DoD is not doing well and is starting to evolve, but is still not doing well in the incubator space, incubating new ideas and growing new technology. In the accelerator space, I'm going to talk about accelerators in a little bit here. We're also going to talk a little bit about angel and venture investment. So in the DoD's world, that's done via small business innovation research funds. But I would even argue that needs to evolve to get where we want. And then just my internal, putting on my AFRL hat for a minute, the way we do contracting, the way we do legal matters. Why can't we adopt more of a LegalZoom type approach? Why can't we adopt, somebody give me your cell phone number right now. I will send you $50, like that, right? Why can I do that right now, but it still takes a week, 2 weeks to send money within the DoD? Why is that? Why are we accepting that? And I would argue that there are people that are pushing that are going to change that, hopefully for the better. We'll skip over that. Okay, so let me get into the defense world. So let me talk a little bit about kind of on the big global defense, and then we'll talk about the Air Force side of things. So the first group I want to talk about is the Defense Innovation Unit Experimental. So I talked about that corporate outpost. Well, this was 3 years ago. This was Defense Secretary Carter's effort to set up a quote-unquote corporate outpost in Silicon Valley, Boston, Austin, and then as well DC, right? That's where the money comes from. So what's fascinating about DIUX is they took somewhat of a startup mentality with it, right? They took a startup mentality with it. They went through a couple cycles of working out what exactly their business model was. One of their big challenges when they first set up in Silicon Valley was that they had all these great interactions with all these cutting-edge software development companies, and largely that was Carter's goal, was to go after these companies that are doing mostly software development that weren't interacting with the DoD. But as they were interacting with these companies, they would have some initial meetings, but then it wouldn't go anywhere, or they would get bogged down going into the traditional contracting, procurement, acquisition cycle that the DoD is used to. And so they iterated on the model, and they now use what's called the Commercial Solutions Offering, CSO. And what it is basically an authority called Other Transactional Authority. And the goal of it is it's non-FAR based, so we're getting into the acquisition world. But the big idea with it is, can I go in 60 days from putting out a request for proposal and getting you on contract? I think they're averaging about 70 days, but again, 70 days versus a year, that is a tremendous improvement. And I would argue even in the corporate world, a lot of corporations can't even move that fast. So DIUX, they've been fairly successful. They had the support of, obviously, Secretary Carter. They have the support of Secretary Mattis. And they've been able to show that this model works. Now, what they're doing is they're looking for technologies that are fairly mature that can then be brought into the DoD. So they're further up on that S-curve, if you will. There's also another group called Incutel. This actually developed out of the CIA. But they now focus on the larger defense community, defense security community. So Incutel, what's fascinating about them as they look at the intersection of startups, venture capital, and government. And so again, their goal is to maybe a little further back down that S-curve, work with startups as they get going and say, hey, you're developing this new app, you're developing this new technology. Have you thought about coming into the defense marketplace, right? So they've been around for a number of years. There's actually some discussion right now of the DoD setting up a venture fund similar to this. What's fascinating about In-Q-Tel is they operate somewhat like a VC, but only about 20% of their money do they actually put into startups. The majority of it is just training startups and getting technology developed or working with them to develop their technology to a point that then they can invest in, right? Go ahead. Yep. Yeah. So the question was, does In-Q-Tel look for a government sponsor? And they do. As well, I mean, DIUX as well. And the reason for that is there's somewhat this perception within the DoD acquisition of, on one hand, you have the research labs and research organizations that aren't connected to the end users, right? And we're going to talk about that in a second, of you're doing this research just for the sake of research, and it's not tied to that end user. Okay, I'm also going to talk about two other organizations, the Rapid and Capability Office and the Strategic Capability Office. So looking at the DoD level, you have the Strategic Capability Office. This was an organization that was started up in the 90s. It was most recently headed up by, again, this Dr. Roper, who's the head of acquisition for the Air Force. So the Strategic Capabilities Office, their whole mission is to very rapidly take existing military products and adapt them to different end uses. So a good example of that is on the far side here, we have the ATACMS missile. So the ATACMS battlefield missile is an Army missile. They use it to do kind of longer range battlefield rocketry. But the SCO, the SCO, they adopted it and changed it over into a coastal defense mechanism. So rather than shooting it at a bunch of tanks, I'm going to shoot it out at a ship, right, and use it for close-in naval support. Another really good example of, and I love what they did with this, is they took an artillery piece and they said, all right, yeah, traditionally it's ground to ground, right? I'm going to shoot it and it's going to go up and it's going to come back down and it's going to hit the ground. But what if we use this for an air defense mechanism? So I could try and shoot down drones or small airplanes, right? Can I use the howitzer to do that? So it's taking these things that have already been tested, that are already being produced, that are already being bought by the military, and saying, let's just use them a little bit differently. So that's the SCO. And then we also have the Rapid Capabilities Office. So each of the different services have Rapid Capabilities Officers, some versions of it. So at least within the Air Force, the Rapid Capabilities Office, the goal of it is to very rapidly acquire and field new technologies. So a good example of that is the X-37, the space plane. This was something that was in development for a number of years, going back between the Air Force and NASA, back and forth. Finally, the RCO came in, and they got it going. What's fascinating about the RCO, in my view, is when you go back and look at those two S-curves, I would somewhat argue that the traditional Air Force acquisition community, the Air Force Lifecycle Management Center, AFLCMC, is being disrupted by this RCO. And the reason I say that is because the current big acquisition program for the Air Force is the B-21. Any guess of, is it the old player that's doing the acquiring of that system, or is it the new RCO, right? It's the new Rapid Capabilities Office that's doing that B-21, right? So the traditional acquisition model is somewhat being upended. Another organization that I always like to point out is an organization called MD5. And again, you can go out and you can Google all these organizations. So MD5 was stood up, again, about 2015, 2016. And again, are playing in this space of working with startups. Their big goal is to try and actually influence the DoD, the folks inside the DoD. can we bring some of the startup mentality, startup methodologies, and lean practices into the DoD? So they do a number of things, boot camps. They have a program called FedTech. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. They're doing accelerators. Again, I'll talk about that. Hackathons. So I don't know how many folks are familiar with hackathons or have been in a hackathon? Yeah, a few folks. So the idea of a hackathon, it's really developed kind of on the software side of things. Largely has come out of Silicon Valley or Boston. But the idea was to get together a bunch of random people and say, all right, pitch your idea for some new technology. And then over a weekend, we'll hack together that product, that service. So what's interesting about this is MD5 is adapting that to the DoD. They're saying, what about for humanitarian aid? What happens when a hurricane hits and you now disrupted all the infrastructure? There's a lot of chaos, confusion. How do you get supplies in? How do you figure out what's going on situationally? And then over a weekend, can you actually come up with some different products or services that could be then leveraged? So they're doing some work there. AFWorks. How many folks are familiar with AFWorks? A few folks. Good, excellent. I'm glad the Doolittle folks are familiar. I would be concerned. Lori, hopefully you had your hand. Okay, good. All right. So AFWorks, again, I mentioned that I think we're going through this frenzy phase. I think AFWorks, DIUX, I think these are all part of the frenzy phase, getting to the larger question of the acquisition system within the DoD is having challenges, and so now you're having these new entries come in, somewhat trying to disrupt that model. So AFWorks is a very interesting organization. So they started up just last year. They formally got set up this year within the Air Force. They really have 6 different things that they're focusing on. They have what's called innovation hubs. So that, again, that kind of gets to that corporate outpost. So they have innovation hubs in Las Vegas, DC, Austin, and maybe Montgomery. I think Montgomery's in the works as well. Yep. So the whole idea of those innovations, the Doolittle Institute is, again, a very good example of those innovation institutes. Can we get out from behind the fence? Can we get out from behind our desks and interact with companies, organizations that we might normally not interact with, or even just interact in a different environment, right? So those innovation hubs. So somewhat they're leveraging the model of DIUX. There's also another group called SoftWorks. They're also leveraging that model. Again, trying to interact and work with taking end users and connecting them with folks that actually have technologies or solutions to their problems. They also are heading up an effort called SPARK. So this is internal to the Air Force. It's the idea of taking and empowering the folks, the airmen, the first-class airmen, and empowering them to say, hey, you deal with a problem every day and it drives you nuts. Well, rather than trying to get and scream and yell and say, hey, this is a terrible problem, we need to fix it, and trying to get that floated all the way up your chain and then all the way back down the chain into the acquisitions community, empowering them to try and solve the problems. So what's interesting about this is there's been a number of what they call spark cells set up across different bases across the Air Force. But then as well, the chief, the vice chief, they set aside some money, about $60 million, to actually go empower these types of things. So a very good example of something that's occurring. AFRL, we're working with a group out at Travis Air Force Base. So one of the challenges they have is when the C-5s take off, and if you take off from somewhat of a contested area, they have to have the loadmaster stand on either side of the airplane looking out the back windows to see if there's any threats that are coming up. And so in one hand, they have a walkie-talkie, in the other hand, they have a flare dispenser, and they have nothing to actually hold on to. And so they were getting injured. They were hurting their backs. They were falling down because the plane is maneuvering while they're doing this. And so imagine standing on a plane and you've got both hands occupied, and what's going to happen? You're going to get thrown around. And so we're working with them. But in the traditional acquisition process, that would have had to go up all these layers and then come all the way back down. And by the time that happens, more people have been hurt. And so AFWorks is fantastic because they're making those connections very rapidly, trying to solve those problems very rapidly. They're also doing grand challenges. They're doing Fridays at AFWorks. Basically, the idea is put out a topic area and say, hey, if you've got some kind of technology or solution or product in this area, come pitch it to us. Come talk with us. And we'll make connections with end users, with technologists to either further develop or to bring it into the acquisition. Yep.
Doolittle is one, Wright Brothers in Dayton, Griffiths Institute up in Rome, New York, and then the AFRL New Mexico out at Kirtland, and then in DC it's called the BRIC. But that's a powerful infrastructure for responding to even the challenges that AFWorks finds. So Doolittle is a key component of that.
Yeah, and that's fantastic. I appreciate that, Nick. So as well, for everybody's aware, Nick Hitchcock, so he actually works in the same office as I do. He heads up kind of oversees all those institutes. And so one of the big things we're doing right now is trying to make a better connection between AFWorks, the innovation institutes such as Doolittle, and AFRL, right? Because in essence, what's happening is AFWorks is making all these connections, but how do we actually solve these problems? How do we bring in companies? How do we do all of that? So that's happening, and I'm very glad you brought that up. Doolittle is a perfect example of basically a mechanism that can be leveraged to try and very rapidly solve some of these problems. Technology accelerators, I'm going to talk about this in a little bit. And then as well, Spark Tank. So Spark Tank kind of goes back to that Spark Cell model, but it was started last year. And the idea, how many folks have seen Shark Tank? Shark Tank, yeah. Hopefully most folks are at least somewhat familiar with it. So the idea was basically pitch your idea, and then the top 6 were able to then make their pitch to the secretary and to a number of other senior leaders, and then as well they got further funding to develop their technology or their solution for the problem that most of them were experiencing in their day-to-day careers and day-to-day jobs. So again, another mechanism to try and rapidly get problems that are not making it up through the acquisition requirements foundation, structure. So AFWorks, I kind of mentioned this model, but largely what they're trying to get to is more of in my view, a neural network, right? So rather than having a very stovepiped methodology for getting requirements and connecting end users with those with technologies, they're saying let's form this neural network so that we can rapidly solve these problems rather than waiting for it to go through and waiting for it to get discovered in somebody's email inbox, right? All right, so I'm going to shift gears a little bit. I want to talk about AFRL. So put on my AFRL hat. I want to talk about AFRL and what AFRL is doing as well. So when I talk about innovation within AFRL, and as well you could look at it across the DoD, I look at it with this lens. I basically look at the ways to influence innovation. You can do it through a number of mechanisms. You can, starting at the bottom, you can develop new tools, new methodologies, new processes. You can set up infrastructure. I think the Doolittle Institute here is a perfect example of that infrastructure. If you look at my office where I sit, it is literally straight out of Office Space. I mean, it's literally like, it's like set right off of Office Space, right? So imagine that infrastructure and what that does to both the interactions and creativity and actually solving problems versus a much more open, much more lower barrier to interaction facility such as this. What about strategy, right? You can set up strategy, you can set up the overall vision, but it really gets to culture. In my view, at the end of the day, if you look at AFRL, You can set up, and we're working on setting up all of these things, but it's the culture at the end of the day that really, you could do the first 4 things, and if you don't shape that culture, it's going to be for naught, right? So part of my goal, part of my job is shaping that culture. And so I'm going to talk about some of the things that we're trying to do that. So one of the big things I always like to call out is the human capital strategy. Again, putting on the AFRL lens, I recognize that there's a lot of small businesses here, but hopefully this helps shape your thinking as well. So it's recognizing that me as an AFRL scientist engineer, I was unfortunately not hired for my looks. There's a joke in the office that I am the Brad Pitt, but that's not the case. My movie career never took off, right? Our scientists and engineers, they were hired for their brains, right? They were hired for their brains. And let's acknowledge that they're a knowledge workforce, right? And as well, the organizations, the companies that we work for, sorry, you guys are not hired for your looks, right? Sorry, I don't mean to hurt your feelings. You're hired for your brains, right? We want to work with you because of your brains. And so let's acknowledge that. So let's focus on innovation, continuous learning, recognizing that you have to take risks, and that the best way to take risks is actually through failing, right? How many folks, so I always like to ask this question, how many folks have failed today? Anybody? Anybody failed? I've failed a couple times today, right? So I actually asked this question, I had a STEM workshop, I asked it for 10th graders. They all raised their hand, right? So stop and think for a minute. If you guys are not failing, are you learning, right? Isn't the best way to learn is to try something? I have a theory. I think this will work. I think if I do this, I'll have this outcome. Oh, that didn't work. I'm going to learn from that, right? And sometimes failure sucks. It hurts. It sucks. But you have to get through those failures. I worked on a program within AFRL called the X-51. It was to flight test a hypersonic vehicle, a scramjet engine in a hypersonic vehicle. I would argue we had 4 flights. The 4th flight was the most successful. And the reason the 4th flight was the most successful is because we failed in different ways on the previous 3, right? And we learned more from the failures than I would argue we learned from the success, right? If we just succeed at everything, we're not learning anything. Continuous pursuit of excellence, diversity of thought. And so there's really 3 goals, autonomy, mastery, and purpose, right? Let's acknowledge that you potentially have a PhD within AFRL, you're working with AFRL. Let's give you some autonomy. Let's allow you to take some risks. Let's allow you to use that brain. So a couple years ago, we started up a group called Shift AFRL, again, internal to AFRL, very similar to those Spark cells. And I think in my view, we'll probably adapt that model and move into that Spark cell model. But the whole thing was to adapt or perish. Now as ever is nature's exonerable imperative, right? We've got to be iterating, trying new things. If you look at those S-curves, we've got to be trying new things. So what's happening within AFRL? And I would say within the last 2-3 years, this is all started up within the last 2-3 years. So there's a lot on this chart. I'm just going to run through it very briefly. So working with technology accelerators. I'm going to talk about what technology accelerators are. There's some different uses of that language, but I'm going to talk about what we're doing there. We also have the intellect-to-intellect exchange, the eye-to-eye exchange. And the goal of that was to actually embed our researchers at quote-unquote innovative organizations. So take our sensors researcher and place them out with Google. So yes, doing joint research and development, but they're also experiencing the cultural side of things, so that when they come back to the sensors director, when they come back to internal to AFRL, they can say, well, when I was out at Google, the very first day, they handed me a laptop. It had all the software I needed on it. I had all the access I needed, and I was able to then start working that afternoon. Whereas when I came into AFRL, it took me a couple weeks to get access to my computer, to get the software loaded, and I'm still fighting with computer support to let me have full access to it, right? So can we expose our folks, do joint research and development, but also influence that culture side? So we've worked with Google, we've worked with IBM, Facebook, Oculus VR, and there's an effort right now to work with SpaceX as well. Yeah, please. Yeah, so what we do, the mechanism that we utilize for this is a CRADA, Cooperative Research and Development Agreement. So what's fascinating about the CRADA is largely if you think about it from two different frames of reference. So let's take Google's frames of reference. So Google does not want to be tied up with the government on IP, right? They don't want to interact. The government says, no, we've got to have IP. And so what we ended up doing with the Google is we basically said, we're only working with you for 2 months. Largely intellectual property is not going to be developed. And if it is, we'll waive off, right? So we were able to do it under that CRADA vehicle. So we've used that CRADA before. We also used another program when we worked with Facebook. We actually went through a university. So we used a program called the Visiting Scientist Program as well. We also stood up a program, the Entrepreneurial Opportunities Program. And so, in my view, I think we didn't quite get this one right. But the idea of it was basically to say, hey, you're a smart person. You're developing technologies within AFRL. You're probably most intimately aware of that technology and where it is. And so why don't we enable you, empower you to actually take the step, if you want to actually lay the foundation for starting a business and then actually stepping out and starting a business. And if it doesn't work, we'll pull you back in. So it's actually based off a model out of Sandia National Labs, the Department of Energy. They've had it for about 20 years. They've had about 150 folks take that step out, start small businesses. And so the beauty of this is you then somewhat get to this challenge of within the labs, you develop technologies in-house, but then it just sits on the shelf. It doesn't get out into the commercial world, if you will, whether that be selling to the DoD or selling actually to a true commercial. And so it's trying to get at that issue. I would argue that structurally we set it up incorrectly, but I think it's a very interesting model, and I'd like to do more with it. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
And I said that the shift in culture that you're talking about, it's pretty significant, and I'm just wondering what approach you're taking to implement it. Are you taking a top-down approach where it's mandated by the highest levels of the DoD, or is it more of a bottom-up approach where you're trying to convert individual people one at a time through their interactions with the private sector and hoping that it eventually translates to the whole organization?
So I view yes on both sides. So in my view, it's got to happen from both sides, and I think it is happening from both sides, right? So if you look at the AFWorks, the spark cells, that is a bottom-up. That is a bottom-up approach. Yes, it's somewhat being set up by overall leadership, but it's really more empowering those folks. The Shift AFRL organization that I talked about, that was all grassroots. That was all grassroots. Now, some of these other things, we are a hierarchical organization. We are a military organization, and so you need that leadership support. And so it's got to come from both sides, in my view. Partnering with entrepreneurs. So that Entrepreneurial Opportunities Program is really kind of a big step for a lot of our researchers. But again, getting back to that cultural side, can we actually just expose them to working with entrepreneurs? And one way to do that is actually take a researcher that's developed some intellectual property and partner them up with entrepreneurs or startups. And we do that through a number of programs. One is the Commercialization Academy up in Rome, New York, and that's being run by the Griffiths Institute, so very similar to the Doolittle Institute. And they take intellectual property that's developed. So up in Rome, they're the Information Directorate, so they focus on cyber and software development. And so they actually partner them up with entrepreneurs. And what's fantastic about this program is they actually now have community and outside investments into these new startups that are pulling AFRL technology out of the labs. You also have the FedTech program, and then as well there's the Startup Technology Acceleration Project in Dayton, and then in University of New Mexico they have their Technology Navigator Challenge. But largely all the same model of taking IP, taking a researcher, and saying, focus on what you do well of researching, but as well work with this entrepreneur to say, yes, here's the military side of things, but what would you do on the commercial side? How would you actually structure it? We're also working to set up innovation hubs. I would argue that all the innovation institutes, whether it's Doolittle or such, they're all somewhat in this innovation hub space, but we're working on setting up some of those environments. So one is 444, that's actually the street address in Dayton. But what's fascinating about this is it's a very open facility, and on the first floor, on one half of it you have the Wright Brothers Institute, so again similar to Doolittle, but literally right on the other side with no walls in between, you have the local business incubator. So you have startups, you have small businesses that are literally right there, right next to, in the same building, in the same space as the Air Force Research Labs and the Wright Brothers Institute. Very similar model with University of New Mexico at the Rainforest as part of Innovate ABQ. So what they did is they actually took a university. So it kind of gets to this model of, they call them innovation districts, where you take a larger research or development organization, you put them in a very close proximity to startups and small businesses, and you can grow businesses out of that. So the Rainforest was an effort in Albuquerque to do that. So you have Air Force in the form of Air Force Research Labs. You have Sandia National Labs, and I forget the other DOE organization, but you have them plus a university plus startups. They just opened the facility and they're out of space already. They're already out of space. So again, a fantastic model of doing things a little bit differently. Doolittle Institute, I would argue you guys are an innovation hub as well. The fact that largely most folks can walk in the door and start a conversation, start interacting, versus trying to get through the fence and all those challenges. I do need a picture, so today I'm getting a picture. We also have maker hubs, maker facilities. So on the more personal hands-on level, can we enable our folks to do rapid prototyping, very rapid prototyping? And actually it could be on the physical side, whether it's 3D printer or CNC or lathe, or on the software side. Can we set up software sandboxes so that then I can come and test out 10 different software platforms and figure out which one I actually want to use, so that then I can run it back inside the base through all the wickets and all the paperwork to actually bring it in and utilize it on base. So then, what's great about that is via these maker hubs, we can now access the Google Cloud, we can access Amazon's software services, right? But we can very rapidly prototype. We can fail through a number of iterations, taking a model from the startup world, but we can do that on a very, very low barrier to entry. I'm going to talk about what we're trying to do with SBIRS. We're trying some things there. And then as well, we also have the innovation pipeline. So this is something myself and another individual are heading up. And it gets to, can we influence culture? So it's basically a pot of money that's been set aside to do innovative efforts. And as well, efforts that weren't planned for. So a good example of this is there's a team of folks focused on autonomy called Act 3. They're actually acting as a startup. So they've set up some offices off base in the Wright Brothers Institute facility. They took it from an idea to actually getting folks in place and starting to do software development in autonomy. And so we were able to fund them. It was something that was unplanned for, unpalmed for, and we were able to very rapidly get them funds. We're also doing, it's called the ... challenge, but again, getting to that cultural side of things, can we actually influence folks? And so one of the things that we did, there's this idea called design sprints out in the kind of as a corporate best practice, but it's this idea of bring together a team of folks for maybe 3 days or 5 days, bring them together and very rapidly run them through a process, starting with a problem at the beginning of the week and getting to a solution by the end of the week, and very rapidly doing that. And so we were able to put out some incentives to incentivize our workforce to actually go do that, right? We said, we'll give you some money for your research and development. And so one of the first examples of something that's come out of this is there is the SEER school, the Survival, Evaluation, Rescue, and Evasion School. I may have messed up the acronym, but they basically train folks for when a pilot goes down behind enemy lines, right? So they had a problem, I think about a year ago. they do these training exercises where they send folks out into the swamps for 5 days or something. Well, one of the airmen passed away from hypothermia. And so they said, all right, well, what do we do about this? How do we address this challenge? And so this team came together, and over a week, they developed some technology. They pulled some technology that had already been developed. They did some software development, and they were able to hack together. It was a very rudimentary prototype, but literally 2 weeks later, they were down at the SEER school, and they had a vest that had temperature sensors, heart rate sensors, all on the vest so that they could monitor the airmen. That then went to a cell phone that the airmen wore, that then went to a sat phone that could then be sent up, and that somebody at the command center could then monitor the health of all the individuals as they were out on their own trying to survive and evade, right? So again, very rudimentary prototype, but it validated the model, right? It started to get at it very rapidly. A number of other efforts that have been around for a couple years here, but again, kind of get to that innovation side of things. We do what's called the Commander's Challenge. It's basically taking a urgent warfighter need and pulling our folks together and saying, all right, try and solve this problem in 6 months, and go from problem to prototype in 6 months. This is actually going to be floated up to the entire Air Force so that anybody can participate in it. We've got that. We've got the Engineer and Scientist Exchange Program. This is where we can send folks to other countries. So I've had friends that have gone over to the UK, Australia, Netherlands, Germany. This is, again, getting that cultural side of things. They all do research and development a little bit differently, and their acquisition within the defense world a little bit differently. So can we get exposed to those cultures? We have the Developmental Opportunities Program. This is basically a sabbatical program. We also have Tech Warrior, and that's going to be talked about. Education with Industry, Visiting Scientists Program. Again, getting our folks out of the lab, out of the cube farm. And then as well, I always make a plug for the Junior Force Council, trying to shortcut and train our new generation of workforce, but as well get the folks that are down in the trenches a way to voice their problems and voice their concerns or voice their ideas to senior leadership. And I'm a big fan of that Junior Force Council. So we're doing some open innovation challenges. I'll talk about this briefly. So the idea of an open innovation challenge is basically I put out an award. I say I have a problem. The ones we're focusing on right now is around agile basing. So we have two, one that just closed and one that's open right now, around runway inspection. So if a runway is damaged after a battle, how do I rapidly inspect that runway before I send my folks out? And then as well, we have one around runway repair. So how do we rapidly repair? So what's interesting about this idea is that basically the ideas can come from anywhere. It's open to the world, so we can get ideas. In fact, previous efforts here, the idea has come from Russia or the middle of Australia, right? That's where the solution comes from. It's recognizing the fact that while yes, we are hired for our brains, not all the best ideas are in this room, right? So what we're also doing with this is we're taking, we're getting your idea, but then we're actually going to take it and we're going to prototype it. We're going to go through another cycle where we actually prototype and demonstrate it, and we'll collaborate with Tech Warrior to do that. And then as well, we'll bring it into the acquisition community. So another mechanism to bring in new ideas, new technologies, new solutions. Special topics. So SBIR. This last cycle, how many small businesses here do SBIRs? All right, excellent. How many saw the special topics that we were doing? And how many actually put in special topics? Okay, all right, good. Okay, that's good feedback, and I'll probably talk with you. So what we're trying to do here, and maybe a better way is looking at this. So we're trying to go after a couple things. Can we drive a benefit for the Air Force, for small businesses, and for the end user? And can we do that? So traditionally an SBIR program, for the folks that aren't familiar, it's a very set process of acquisition. It's the government's version of seed and venture funding. But traditionally it's the initial award is up to 9 months and $150K to do a feasibility study. And then followed on by a quote-unquote phase 2, where it's a longer duration prototyping. And so we said, well, we're engaging with all these startups. The startups don't take 9 months to do a feasibility study. They usually go through technology accelerators, and I'm going to talk about those in a second, and they do it in 3 months. So can we disrupt this model a little bit? And so we put out a call for around 6 different topics and said, let's do 3 months, 50K efforts. Let's see if we can do this a little bit more rapidly. And so then, can we get to a phase 2 quicker where we're actually doing the prototyping? And can we actually speed up that prototyping as well? And what's interesting about what we were trying to do with this is, yes, we're focusing on the technology, but we're also focusing on the business side of things, the quote-unquote business side of things. Is there really an end user that is really demanding and saying, yes, this is a good solution? So we did it in 18.2, or in the last cycle. We did this 50K. We're actually going to do a 75K 3-month effort. We've got 9 topics that we're putting out in 18.3. So again, we're doing multiple iterations. We're experimenting with multiple things within the SBIR program. If SBIR program is truly the government's seed and venture capital mechanism, well, let's experiment with the ways that we utilize that. What we're also trying to drive to it is, go for it. Yeah. So the question was, what TRL level were we looking for in the special topics? So if we jump back here, so we had 6 special topics. One was around counter UAS, counter drone. So the DoD has spent all this money developing drone technology. And now, let's take Syria as an example. Russia, their base was attacked by a bunch of drones. And the drones blew up a number of their aircraft, damaged a number of their aircraft. So you had multi-million-dollar aircraft damaged by $800 drones, right? So we've developed all these drones. Now how do you defend against them? We have one around weather, terrestrial weather monitoring, one around precision navigation and timing, so GPS, one around human-centered ISR, one around logistics, and one around open innovation. So to answer your question, the open innovation one, we were actually looking for higher TRL levels. And the reason for that is we were basically saying, take commercial technologies that are already out there and as part of the feasibility study, figure out how do you bring it into the military. So take something that's already been proven on the commercial side, and how do you adapt it? How do you bring it into the military side of things? That's what we're trying to do with the Open Innovation one. And we're actually running that again in 18.3. We're going to do it in 19.1, and we're going to continue that, and we're going to keep that going. But the barrier to entry to that one, it's got to be sold on the commercial non-defense market. All right? Do you have a question? Yeah. Yeah. So we're trying to disrupt that as well. So the Open Innovation one, we had 166 proposals come in. We're going to award more than the traditional 2 or 3, and we're going to try and make those awards by the end of July. So in essence, the period closed June 20th. We've made the selections. The announcements have gone out, and we're going to actually try and get them on contract. It's just purchase orders. Part of it is the prioritization, right? It's the prioritization of both on the evaluator side of things and on the contracting side of things. And so can we say, all right, can we try and move quickly on this? Small businesses, as they're hanging out there waiting for 6 months to hear and actually get on contract, can we as the Air Force move quickly? Go ahead.
For open innovation, are you looking for a product, so something that has been sold already, right?
So we're looking for something that's already being sold on the commercial non-defense market that can be then adopted and brought in. Google Air Force SBIR, right? And then that'll take you to the website. There'll be a call for topics. 18.3, I think it'll go out, I think September timeframe. If there's somebody from SBIR, they may have a better idea. But September timeframe will be that call. We'll start to see that call. Go ahead, Mick.
I think one other point to make on these special topics is it's radically different from a typical SBIR, also from the context that they are weaving in the marketing and the business model development. So for the PNT and the human-centered ISR topics,
And I'm
Oh, you were going into
yeah,
that?
I'm gonna get
All
into that, so.
I'll let Ryan.
No, good. I got a couple slides on that. So you asked the question on TRL. So the open innovation one, it's more developed, right? The other ones, less developed. So I'm going to talk about why less developed on those. Let me get to that one second. Yep, let me get to that one second. So what we're also trying to say is traditionally the SBIR application is a 20-page technical proposal. And sorry, just from an evaluator side of things, there's a lot of fluff in that 20 pages sometimes. It's a lot of effort to a lot of times to just try and fill out that 20 pages. And so from our perspective, can we get to more of the commercially accepted model of if I'm going to go pitch an angel investor or a VC, I'm going to take my pitch deck. I'm going to take my pitch deck and I'm going to make my pitch to them, right? So what we did with this was we said, give us a 5-page technical and combine that with a 15-page slide deck. And so having done the traditional 20 pages evaluation, I really like this new model because now it somewhat forces the companies to very quickly get to what their value proposition is, what their technology actually is. And if they can't concisely do that in 5 pages plus the 15-page slide deck, then it's to their detriment, right? But this is the accepted model in the commercial world. Let's adopt that and take some of those benefits and bring it over to the DoD side. So TRL level. So I'm going to get into that in a second here, but first I want to talk about technology accelerators, also known as startup accelerators. How many folks use Dropbox? Dropbox, yeah. Reddit? How many folks have been into Reddit today? All right, good. What about Airbnb? Yeah, Airbnb? Okay, a few folks? Yeah. So all of those have gone through this startup accelerator process. So the idea of the startup accelerator process is actually very similar to SBIR. It's got a lot of similarities there. So what they do is, kind of on the far side, they put out a problem area. And so they say, in the travel space, in travel or vacationing space, any startups in that space, put in a proposal to go through our accelerator. And so you get a couple hundred startups go through. They down select to 5 to 10 to actually go through what they call the cohort. And the goal of this whole accelerator process is they go through a 3-month facilitated accelerator or incubator process where it's really focusing and making connections for the small business with other companies in that space. So yes, not only it's no longer I'm competing against you, it's also, all right, I may be working with you. And so what's fascinating that a lot of times comes out of these accelerators is you actually see a merge of some of the ideas. But as well, you get connected to end users, and the idea is that you spend a lot of time talking with customers. One of the big focuses in the startup world is get out the front door and go talk to people. They'll have people talk to 100 different customers. Because if I have my idea for my little travel app, I may think it's the greatest idea in the world, but if you all think it's crap, you're not going to buy it, and nobody's going to put money into my little startup. So can I validate my model by talking with as many end users and as many potential customers as possible and really figure out what is my true niche? So they go through this 3-month process, and at the end of it, they make their pitch. They call it Demo Day, but it's the Shark Tank. It is literally the Shark Tank. The Shark Tank TV show is kind of hybridized or TVized that model. And so they make their pitch at Demo Day with the whole goal of getting further funding. What's fascinating about this is from a TRL level, it's very, very immature technology. Because their whole goal is to get that funding to further develop the technology. But they're not focusing in this accelerator on technology development. They're focusing maybe a little bit on technology development. They may do some prototyping. They're focusing on the business, on the feasibility side. And so, can we take this model and adapt it and apply it with SBIRs? So what we did, 2 of those topics that we did, one around PNT and one around human-centered ISR, we said, let's take this model and let's use the phase 1 to actually run you through the accelerator. So the folks that are accepted for that phase 1 will go through the accelerator process. We have other funds that are going in that are being used to set up this accelerator process. And then at the end of it, when you make your pitch to angels and venture capital, you're also making your pitch to us on your phase 2. What's interesting about this is because we went to the 50K 3 months, we're now able to make 8 to 10 awards versus the traditional 2 to 3 awards. Because it's the same amount of money, but we now have more options. We've opened up our bullpen a little bit to give us more chances at a potential success. And we're saying to the companies, you really need to figure out your feasibility side of things. Yes, on the technology side, but also on the end user side of things, right? And so we're putting some onus on those companies. And from a traditional SBIR side of things, it's different from what we usually do. But when you look out at the commercial world, at the startup world, this is the common practice. Sometimes some companies will go through multiple iterations of these accelerators. Questions? Yeah, go ahead. I guess I don't know if I'm saying that we're looking for high risk necessarily. What we're really looking for is, yeah, there may be some risk, but buy down some of that risk by actually talking with the end users and spending time with the end users, right? So I guess does that answer?
Let's see. I guess I'm curious on are you looking like for, angel investors are looking for money return. So are you looking for a similar money return on the investment?
So that's the beauty. That's the beauty of it, is because we're using SBIR, it's a non-equity stake in the company. So no, we are not taking an equity stake in your company, right? If you went through a traditional accelerator, they are taking an equity stake, right? That's their game in this is, I'm going to take a 6% equity stake and I'm going to give you $100K to help you go through this 3-month accelerator. But now I have 10 companies with a 6% stake and only one may succeed. But when you become the Airbnb, I've now made my millions, right? When you look at the SBIR, because it's the government, it's a non-equity stake. And so I mean, it's the same SBIR program. It's just we're leveraging it and we're sponsoring these accelerators. So a good example of that is we worked with probably one of the most well-known accelerators is a company called Techstars. There's really two big players, Y Combinator and Techstars. So if you look at the accelerator world, we worked with, and when I say we, it was AFWorks. AFWorks sponsored it, but we also had, it was run through AFRL. Worked with Techstars around autonomy. Specifically, we were really focused on counter UAS, counter drone, but there was a lot of more autonomous type technologies. So again, we've done this, AFWorks has done this once, we've done it twice with AFRL. We did one around space situational awareness and one around weather. And so we've done those previously, and as I mentioned, we're now running the 2 accelerators here in the fall-winter time frame, and then we're running another one in Albuquerque in the winter time frame around data analytics for space, and we're going to set up an SBIR for that one as well. Go ahead.
Does the sole source sales position come along with that, the special topics, just like it does on the regular SBIRs?
Yeah, so we are not changing anything in the actual legal requirements or anything like that. There is no equity stake. We're just saying, let's pull some different levers. Let's play with the application process. Let's play with the funding and timelines, right? Let's try some experiments. We may fail at this, right? So the open innovation topic, we got 166 proposals in. That was the most proposals that the Air Force has seen in a decade, that most folks could remember, by a good 100, right? So we're at least saying, okay, either a lot of folks are just throwing darts at the dartboard and hoping, or there is some validity in what we're trying here. But we are not, from a legal standpoint, we're not changing anything. We haven't really gotten any waivers on anything. We're just saying, all right, let's do something different than the same old thing every time. Right? Okay. As I mentioned, and actually this is a dated slide, but 18.3, we've got 9 topics coming out. We're actually going to do one around services, acquisition services. So this will be coming out soon. As I mentioned, we're doing that open use or open innovation one. We're also doing one around training VR, AR. And then we're going to be doing some more into the future. Right? So in 18.3, one of the ones that's going to be coming out is actually looking at Air Force AFRL developed technology. And it's going to say, all right, we've already developed the technology in-house. We've matured its TRL level to a certain point, but it's sitting within the labs. How do we get it out of the labs? How do we get it out of the labs and into the commercial world? And so the idea of this is it's an artificial hair sensor, and it's this nanotube that you can stick onto a UAV or something like that in a wind tunnel, and you can measure then the airflow, the pressure changes over that airfoil. So it's been developed within AFRL. We have a patent on it. It's now sitting on the shelf. And how do we get it out? So we're saying we'll actually put some SBIR dollars around this, and we'll give you $50K to spend, look at the feasibility from the business side of things, and which markets would you go after, who talk to end users, who's actually going to buy this. And then as well, we'll give you some money for further prototyping and development, right? So it's a very niche market that this would likely go into, but how do you actually get it out into those markets? So we're experimenting with that. So rather than having the 1,000 patents that just sit there and don't do anything, can we actually try and enable some of it? All right, so the last thing I'm going to talk about, within AFRL, we're going to start setting up kind of a process very similar to SBIR, but kind of an internal process where we give some initial seed funding to folks as they have ideas, right? So let's say there's 60 people in this room. We'll give you each 10K. You've got a novel idea, something new you want to try out. Come make your pitch to us. We'll give you 10K to start prototyping, to start experimenting, talking with end users. Well, probably only 20 of you will actually do that and actually do something successful and have something come out. And so then can we iterate a couple times and each time go through these kind of, they call them growth boards, to a point where it can then be, that idea can then be launched into a bigger market and solve a bigger problem. So it's adapting, it's affecting the cultural, from a cultural standpoint, it's bringing in some of these lean startup methodologies. If you talk to any startup, they'll talk about the lean startup. They'll talk about the business model canvas, or in our case, the mission model canvas. And so can we bring some of these methodologies, some of these examples into AFRL? So with that, be happy to take questions. Also happy to, and maybe afterwards, come tell me if there was something that you didn't agree with or you didn't think was good. I'm always experimenting as I do these presentations, seeing what works, what doesn't work. So come tell me if something doesn't work or if something was interesting to you. So happy to take questions, but not from you. I'm kidding. Go ahead.
Oops, sorry. Really quickly, before we start,
yeah.
for questions, I would like, just raise your hand and we can pass the microphone around. That way we capture all of them. And then I also wanted to let you know, I noticed a few of you were taking pictures of the slides. For every presenter who will allow it, we will be posting the slides on the Doolittle Institute website. So go ahead and feel free. I say within a couple of weeks we should have, again, any presenter who will allow us to present those slides. So now for questions, just raise your hand and I'll come and hand you the mic. Your question. Oh wow, look at me.
Other questions? I was hoping not to get any questions. Go ahead.
Would you speak to a comparison from the private sector to the defense sector and government?
Yeah.
The motivations of the people involved, the creative energies, kind of dramatically different in terms of the G factor, if you will.
Yep.
The greed factor,
Yep.
if you want to just go coarse. I could dress it up, but it's about the money. And so how are your teams, how are they treated, how are they dealt with? And secondarily, there's the upside of great wealth building from great success in the private sector. There's also the downside of the failure. Mm-hmm. And so, so you've got a yin-yang here of the great upside and the great downside. If you could just wrap that together and how that's being addressed, along with, I mentioned FailCon is a failure conference of Silicon Valley entrepreneurs. It's very important to consider, because failure is not a common theme.
No.
And it's been said that in Silicon Valley, if you haven't failed 3 to 5 times, you're not a seasoned entrepreneur.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. No, that is fantastic. Thank you. So really, I will somewhat argue on the greed factor. So when we think of startups, we think of Elon Musk, Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, right? But there's also startups that they call them lifestyle startups. And lifestyle startups are not motivated by the greed. They're motivated by, can I help my community? Can I solve a community problem? There is a food desert within Niceville. Can I set up a grocery store within the community? I'm not going to make a ton of money on it, but I'm going to help make the world a better place, right? So there are startups, there are small businesses that it's not a motivation of greed. And I would argue the same thing could be applied, right? Again, Mick, I would guess you could probably jump out into the commercial world. You could probably make a lot more money than you do right now, right? But there are other things that motivate me. And I would say the same thing for me, right?
And if you watch the small businesses, we have a program at WBI called the Technology Acceleration Program. And you watch these guys go through that. You don't see a lot of the greed because most of them are sacrificing their current lifestyle all on the line. Because that's another piece of the startup world is you've got to have skin in the game, and most of them have skin off of most of their body in the game. So that is a little different. And then the motivation internal, as an AFRLer for 38 plus years, you're focused on solving a warfighter problem. So my greed, if you will, is if this allows me to get a solution actually into their hands faster, then yeah, that's my greed factor. So I think there's other motivations, but those are the two that I've seen very prevalent as we work with these startups and trying to move the technologies out of the lab.
Other questions?
Quickly, too, if we can have people introduce themselves when they ask the question.
Thanks. Bogdan Idria, Visitors Technologies. How do we get in touch with all these people from RY, RV, to talk about our problems? We were selected by NASA, STTR program. We have a TRL2 to enter, TRL3 to exit, we promised. But we know that some people at RY and RV are working on similar problems. How do we get in touch with them so we can work together?
So a couple different
Thank you.
mechanisms. Yeah, a couple different mechanisms. So it's not always necessarily the AFRL person or the AFRL person that you need to talk with. Sometimes it's actually the end user, right? Because if there's an end user that's saying, hey, I've got to have this, and right? Sometimes that can be a bigger drum that can be banged. And so I encourage you to engage with AFWorks. I encourage you to engage with Doolittle, because these institutes, they're somewhat of that interface, and that's the beauty of the innovation hubs, is there's somewhat of that interface that can help make those connections into AFRL. The challenge, putting on my AFRL hat, is I get tons and tons of emails of folks like you. And so how do I manage getting the hundreds and trying to talk with 100 different people? And so one of the ways is setting up these SBIRs, right? Because then it's a way for me to say, where is your technology? Give me your pitch in a somewhat structured manner that then I can say, all right, I think this is good. Let's go try this, right? So again, I kind of point back to that.
Glenn Johnson. Hi, Ryan. I got a couple parts to it. First is real short term.
Yeah.
I have my card here.
Yep.
My phone number's on it.
Okay.
So I'll take the $50.
Okay, all right,
Somebody
perfect,
else
good.
But second part, kind of, it swims around some of the other discussion we've had. I've been invited in with some of my partners to these things, the Chem Bio Defense Consortia that have been stepped up in the last year. And those are under the Other Transaction Authority.
Yep.
And what I see a lot of parallels there with the special topics and the tempo they're asking for a true small business is like stunningly aggressive.
Yes.
And so probably, again, TRL 5.6, and that's being generous
Yeah.
from a risk side. So are you looking at the traditional SBIR topics as the TRL 3.4 kinds of developmental things, and then also, you know, getting at this question of what's the motivation? You know, when my experience with SBIR is on both sides, and depending on who was kind of the provider, the topic writer, who was the program manager or project officer, it became, okay, were they intellectually involved and that was their risk side of it? Or, like we just heard, do they want to get something to the user faster? And so how do we balance this, you know, really from, you know, because I'm self-interest, how do we look for this and balance it as a business and go forward?
Yeah. It's a huge challenge, right? And somewhat it also gets to priorities, right? I know our researchers are juggling on a million different things, right? They've got to do their in-house research, they've got to manage their SBIRs, they've got to do their contracting and finance, and also they've got to do their time collars, right? So they're constantly juggling, just as all of you are constantly juggling. I don't have a good answer. So at least what we try and do with these special topics is we make sure that the PM is very engaged. That doesn't solve the problem for the other 100 topics that go out, right? And that doesn't necessarily scale super well because we're at least being somewhat selective of who we're working with. And so that's a challenge that we're going to continue to address. What we're actually going to try and do probably in 19.1 or 19.2 is actually allow anybody that's putting in a topic to do what we're going to call rapid topics. So in essence, you can take some of what we're piloting with these special topics and you can do it now. So you can do 8 awards of 50K versus 3 awards of 150K. To give then the folks, the wider Air Force folks, the sponsors or the TPOCs, the opportunity to say, yeah, I like the model you're using, I want to use that, or your model's terrible and I don't want anything to do with it, right? To at least give them some of these options, right? If we're at least trying to validate what we're doing, can we roll it out, scale it out to the wider area? But I still don't have a true answer for that.
On those topics that are coming out, the 19.2, 3.4, are they still examining or still looking for those opportunities where they'll have basically a dialogue box on the site where someone can put in some ideas or the seeds of ideas for a topic? Is that still available?
So the question was topic generation. So at least right now, it's mostly been internal, and that's partly because it's just there's a very small team of us that are doing this. Part of it is we're trying to tie it back to overall strategy. So like the counter UAS, we recognize that was a big challenge. I guess I don't have a good answer. Yeah. Other questions?
So when we submit the proposals, can you talk about where the chain goes to the decision maker? Like who gets the initial phase, and then where does it go from there to whoever chooses whether we get it or not?
So the question was about, correct me if I'm wrong, but basically once you guys actually put your proposals into the black box, what happens in the black box? I can't tell you, that's a secret. No, I'm just kidding, I'm kidding. Right, so what happens, you guys put it in, it goes up to the DoD level. You submit through the DoD SBIR website, they actually put them together, they do some very initial reviews of it, just to make sure that you're within the constraints, that the yes-nos that you've selected are meeting the legal requirements and such. So they put it together, they put it into a PDF format, and then they send it down to the services. So then it goes down to the Air Force SBIR office. They then load it into their evaluation system, and then it goes out to the PM. So within AFRL, you have within the directorates, you have a SBIR PM in each directorate. They then assign it out to the evaluators. So the evaluators are really the first ones that truly look at it from a technical standpoint. So let's say the 5-page, 15-page slide deck. We had a couple that put in 6 pages, right? And the way we approach that is we're going to read the first 5 pages. And if you have an extra paragraph that's on the 6th page, we're not going to read that, right? You overcame that requirement, or you passed that requirement, right? So we're not just going to throw out, oh, they had 6 pages, we're not even going to read it, right? So we'll at least read that 5 pages. Does that at least, so it goes through the evaluation, we make our selections, it then goes with the contracting, we work with contracting to make sure those selection, non-selection letters go out, and then we work through the contracting side of it. Yeah. Question down here.
Hi, I'm Mike.
Yep.
Do you give feedback to non-selected?
Yes. So the question was, do we give feedback to the non-selected? Legally, yes. You can actually request via the SBIR site for a quote-unquote debrief, right? Where you'll get what we wrote for the strengths and weaknesses for that evaluation on the topics. So, and you make that request via the SBIR site. My whole thing is, I would love to get to the point, legally there's no reason we can't do it, of let's just provide out, hey, here's your feedback when we do the select non-select, right? Because why add another barrier to yeah, so, right? Because in the startup world, right, if we jump back to the startup world, you make a pitch to a VC, they may cut you off after 5 slides and say, I'm not interested, right? And so you've now gotten feedback. Hopefully, if they're good, they'll say, all right, this is why I'm not interested. But they'll do it quickly and they'll move along. Because their big thing is time. Time is their biggest resource. Question in the back.
My name's Aisha. I'm a business consultant with the Small Business Development Center in Fort Walton Beach. You talked about a lot of organizations like DIUX and SCO and MD5. What kind of key performance measures do you use to gauge if these organizations are delivering on their mission, which is rapid technology acquisition?
So the question was, well, what are the KPIs for these organizations? And it's a challenge. It's a challenge in my mind because, just somewhat, maybe if I take the example of AFRL. So doing all these efforts within AFRL, but a lot of times the question is, what's the ROI? What's the ROI on it? Well, I just started, what's the ROI on this facility, right? How do you measure that ROI? You can't necessarily measure it as revenue, right? So again, if I point back to that startup way, what they argue and what gets discussed quite a bit is innovation accounting. Is basically keeping track of, all right, we tried this many things, and it's not about necessarily the outcomes, it's more of what did you learn, right? Going back to the previous comment of, you failed 5 times, what did you learn from each of those failures, right? So that then, as you go into your 6th time, you're now more likely to succeed than you were the previous 5. It's a major struggle. So for each of those programs, there's specific things that they track. So like, let's take DIUX. DIUX is looking at how fast can they get on contract, right? So that's one of their metrics that they're tracking. They also look at what companies are they working with, right? And are they actually then bringing those technologies in, and how is that influencing the DoD side of the larger acquisition community? How's that being influenced? It's a struggle. It's a struggle. What's the ROI on R&D, right? How do you measure that over a 10-year time frame? Hypersonics is a good example. We spent 50 years and billions of dollars developing hypersonics. How do you actually measure that ROI? It's a challenge.
All right, we have time for about one more question. I know Ryan's going to be here the rest of the day,
Yes.
so we can catch up with him a little bit. We're going to go into a 10-minute break after this question and be back in here at 10:40. So with that, I'm a little bit biased. I'm already on this side of the room, so you get the last question.
Hi, my name is Kent Alexander, and I work with a small business that's working with the Air Force up in Dayton, Ohio, and the Navy up in McLean. And we've started our own technology accelerator program working with these customers. It's focused on business process automation. It's going to be part of modernization of a system called JEDMIX. It's an old data management system they've decided to upgrade with a variety of capabilities. So we have 14 different business modules to develop workflow applications, and we're looking for partners that can provide topics that apply to workflow and business process. And what we do in return is we provide access to the software via the cloud. We give you training on the software, and as you develop the application, we help you demonstrate it and show it to your particular customer in the Air Force. And we also support you taking your application and getting it on the Air Force network. Anybody that does software for the government knows that ATO process is one of the biggest barriers in actually having the success. And we're helping to do that, and we also have a partnership with Microsoft to where we can take your applications and actually put it on their marketplace website to where it could be sold to other federal organizations or really anyone in the commercial world. So any of your small businesses here that are interested in developing business process workflow, please contact me sometime during the day. Give me your information, and I'll get you involved and give you information about the project. But it's very close to the Accelerator program that you just presented here. I'm really pleased to see that because it gives us an indication that we're moving in the right direction because we're very similar. Thank you.
So what I think you were